it here, is a moment when we are accepting that invitation of the universe to be in joy. It's a moment in which we are opening ourselves to the truth of who we are, the source of who we are, which is that source of joy.
Thank you. When we look at our lives, and I tell you that 95% of your life is coming from the subconscious program, this is not, it's new on a scientific awareness of how this mechanism works. But what's interesting is for 400 years, the knowledge that you could program somebody and control their lives has been available. It was the Jesuits who 400 years ago said, give me a child until it's 7 and I will show you the man. Most people didn't understand what they were saying, and what it is the first 7 years, which we now know biologically and scientifically is the program period. They knew that 400 years ago, and they said if I can get that program in the first 7 years, that program will determine the life of that individual. I'll show you the man because they will represent the program. Now, the really important part is since every one of us has been programmed, the big issue is, so what were those programs? Because if I ask you, so what program did you get when you were 1 year old? I have no idea. I wasn't really there. In fact, you were actually being programmed even before you were born, the last trimester of pregnancy. You were being programmed. And I go, well, this is really a critical issue because the first thing I'm telling you is your life is 95% programmed, and most of that is really disempowering. And of course, the first thing I would think is then, what are those programs so I could deal with them? So I want to make something very easy for you so you don't have to go and review your whole life and try to figure out what the programs are. Save you a lot of time. The fact is this, you are playing the program 95% of the day, meaning your life is a printout of your program. So you don't have to go back in time to review. That would just actually irritate the system more because every time you review those things that unsettled you when you were younger, it just reinforces that same pain that you had earlier. So going back and finding out who did what to who is more than just a waste of time. It actually will set you back. As a matter of fact, there's an old phrase that people have heard, and it says, don't kill the messenger over the message. What that means is this, don't go back and blame all the people that did this and that and that and that. That's irrelevant. Who they are is irrelevant. What's relevant is what program did you walk away with, not who did the event, but what you learned. So now I said, okay, I've been programmed and I have no idea what the program is. I said, then look at your life and here's the simple resolution. Everything in your life that you like and it comes to you is because you have a program to support that. That's wonderful. That means that's great. It's going to come to you because that program is bringing it to you. But in contrast, this is the one that's important. Anything you work hard to accomplish, anything you struggle over to make it happen, anything you put a lot of effort in, I want this, I'm going to work like crazy, I'm going to get this. My first question is, why are you working so hard? And the answer is very simple. Anything you're struggling to try to accomplish, whether it's health or love, relationships, whatever it is, if you're struggling, it represents a simple fact. Your subconscious programming doesn't support that conclusion. So the fact is, what are my programs? Look at your struggle. And wherever you're struggling, the struggle is not because the universe won't provide for you. The struggle is an internal job. The struggle is you're trying to overcome previous programming that prevents you to go to that destination. So the wonderful part about this understanding is you don't have to review your life. You can look right now. At this one moment, just look in your head and say, what are the things that I keep trying to get and they seem to be elusive? I can't get them. They're always out of reach. I say, the universe is not holding back. It's your own invisible subconscious behavior. And once you understand where the issues are and you start to really focus on the point that it's not the universe that's providing the trouble, it's myself, you have the first inclination, the first idea, the first understanding of how to change your life, because now you know exactly what issue is confronting you. And again, if you understand it's an internal issue, then you, and this is the most important part, otherwise this would be the worst seminar you ever heard. The most important part is this: you can change the programming. You can rewrite your subconscious programs. And why is that relevant? If you took the wishes and desires of the conscious mind and used that as a program to put the beliefs into the subconscious mind, it's the most exciting and liberating thing you can ever do in your life. You know why? Because once it's in the subconscious program, 95% of the day, without you even thinking about it, your mind will take you to that direction. And that is your freedom. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I wanted to go a little bit more personal here with both of you. And what was that breakthrough moment in your lives, like that aha moment that really got you to experience, you know, yourselves and live a more wholesome, happy life?
For me, there were actually two. They were about 4 or 5 days apart from each other. The first was when I came here to the banks of Ganga, now 20 and a half years ago. I was 25, in the midst of a PhD in psychology. I was not spiritual. I was definitely not religious, and I was not one of those people even who say, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. In retrospect, of course, now that my understanding of spirituality has grown, I can, of course, look back and say, oh yeah, here were the pieces. But at the time, I would not have even self-identified as a spiritual seeker at all. I came to India just on a travel break in the midst of a PhD program, and I was a scientist and doing pediatric neuropsychology. I had graduated from Stanford undergrad and was then getting a PhD. And I was really very focused, and here's what the equation that the world gives us you need for happiness. You need to have a good degree from a good university, then you need to get a good job, and you need to have a nice house in the right area of town, and you know, a picket fence that's just about the right height, and you need to look the right way, and all of these pieces. And for me at the time, I had really put the pieces together, and so we were what I now refer to as happy by default, where we had the pieces, but what we didn't have was actually a real experience of what joy is. So, came to India traveling. I stand on the banks of Ganga, pretty much just where we do Aarti every night, although I didn't know Aarti, I didn't know Paramarth. We were staying in a hotel. And I had an experience on the banks of Ganga in which it was literally as though a veil that I had had over my eyes for 25 years was just pulled off. And everything that I thought I had understood, everything I thought about who I was, what the universe was just in a split second over. And I literally was knocked to the ground and I burst into tears. They weren't sad tears, of course, but they weren't even happy tears. They were just tears of being in the presence of the truth. It was a visual experience of literally beholding the divine. It was a physiological experience of being one with that which I was beholding. And it was more real than anything I had ever experienced, anything I'd ever been taught, anything I'd ever learned, any goal I ever thought I had had. And so in that moment, who I thought I was, what I thought the universe was, it was over. And although I certainly couldn't articulate in any way what I now was experiencing, in fact, I just kept crying and saying, it's so beautiful, it's so beautiful, it's so beautiful. And that was all it was. It was just so beautiful. And so that was really the first experience that just turned my entire perception, because nothing had changed about me, the physical being. I was the same one who had walked down to the banks of Ganga 5 minutes earlier. And yet everything had changed. And so, yeah. And then about 5 days later, I'm going to fast forward through this really quickly, but I had met Puja Swamiji, and I finally was in a situation of having an opportunity to speak to him. And it was a time where he would answer questions, and he turned to me and he said, yes. And suddenly I was in a state of panic because I didn't have a question, but I was a straight A student, like I was a star academic, and here I was on call. I had to come up with something. And my brain immediately started doing this, and so I asked him about fear. It was something that I had struggled with in my life, and I said, tell me about fear. Why do we fear? And he said, you fear because you don't trust. Okay. And I then gave him my story, the details of which are not relevant. We all have our stories. But to me, my story was a really good one. It was true, of course. It wasn't a fictional story on this physical plane of existence. And it was a story that for 25 years of life had gotten me a lot of, oh my God, oh, you poor thing. And it was a story that for me really explained any time I needed a reason to not be stepping up to the plate of my life, to not be able to be in the present, to not be able to embrace who I was. Well, I had this story, and it was a good story. And everyone's response to the story was, oh, yeah, oh, you know. And I got my head in a lot of people's laps with them, you know, doing this. And Swamiji looked at me, and he said, are you going to take that to the grave? Now, I was 25. And I said, well, God, no, Swamiji, of course not. And he said, well, so are you going to let it go a day before you die? And I said, well, no, I mean, he said, how about a month before you die? And I was silent. I didn't know how to answer that question. Was he saying I was going to die soon? What was his point? And he looked at me and he said, you're waiting for someone to come in and draw the line for you. For someone to come in and say, okay, now you can let it go. He said, no one will. That's up to you. And he said, you can carry it to your grave. You can let it go a day before you die, a week before you die, a month before you die, or tonight. And he said, you know, we have this beautiful ceremony called the Arti. And he said, I'm going to tell them to give you the fire so you can wave the fire. And he said, and after that, I want you to go and stand in Ganga. And I want you to hold Ganga water in your hands. And I want you to take that whole story, all the pain, every aspect of that story, and I want you to offer it to Ganga. Now, I was a scientist, and I was an arrogant and slightly obnoxious scientist. And my journal entries for that day, I was perfectly polite in front of him, but I used to keep a journal, and my journal entries for that day say things like, give it to the river. He says that I should just give it to the river, as though it were an apple core or a banana peel, rather than my life. And at some point, late afternoon, early evening, I had this moment in which some wise part of me came in and said, okay, look. Yes, it sounds quaint. Yes, it sounds sweet. Yes, it even sounds really simplistic. And thank God you've got a world of psychotherapy to go back to who understands the need for a process and understands how long these things take. But right now, you're here. And maybe the point of you coming thousands of miles and winding up in front of this master in orange robes who tells you to give it to the river, maybe there was something in that. And so I committed to myself one thing and one thing only, which was I would do it sincerely. I had no concept that it would work. In fact, I was pretty sure it wouldn't. But I made a commitment simply to sincerity, that I would take the message and do what he asked me to do with sincerity. And I stood in Ganga, with Ganga in my hands, for I have no idea how long. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried, and I stood, and I stood, and I stood. And then it was given. And 20 and a half years later, what I can tell you is it really was given. And it was the sort of thing that, of course, defied everything that I understood about psychology, everything that I understood about anything in the universe. The river doesn't just take our childhood, doesn't just take our pain. But what it made so clear was that there was an I who was separate from that. Because look, here I am standing in the river, and there goes the pain. And there was an I who walked out of the river, and an I who walked back up the ashram without the story, without the identity. And that awareness was for me the moment of realizing that it was never me to begin with. And that who I was this being that was now walking back up into the ashram. And that's been something since then that I've held so dearly and have been so committed to inviting and opening and trying to provide opportunities for more and more people to experience that, because it works, it happens.
In my particular situation, there are very many parallels exactly to what Sadhviji was saying.